Hi guys, I'd just like to apologize quickly for the amount of times I say so in this video. Feel free to take a shot every time I do.
Hello everyone and welcome to my next video. Today we're going to be looking at bento poses for Second Life again. New and improved 2021 version with voice this time, because people were complaining on the last video that, the text was too small and that it, wasn't modern. Anyway, at the time I didn't have a microphone, and I still don't have one, which is one of the reasons why it's taken me so long to get around to doing this. Because I basically had to teach myself how to edit audio without a microphone. So, yes. For the time being, this is kind of the best solution that I could come up with. Anyway, the tutorial this time is going to be a little bit more in-depth than the one last time, so if you're not a total beginner, then I suggest you go back to the other one. Although there are a few mistakes in that one, so if you want a more sort of thorough approach to things, then I guess stick around. Anyway, this time I'm also going to be talking you through how to install Avastar, because I know that might not be completely straightforward to everyone. So yes, I thought it would be smart to have timestamps throughout the video. If I don't get lazy during editing, I will remember to do that. Anyway, so we're going to start off with Avastar. Now, I know that this is not a free software and that some people, think it might be stupid or not worthwhile, but it completely is, and I can completely validate it, because if you plan to move past just posing, then you can use Avastar to rig clothing. So developers, for example, like Legacy or Maitreya, they create dev kits. And in order to rig clothing to those dev kits, it's a lot easier to use Avastar. And I can speak from experience on this. I've tried not using Avastar and it's a nightmare. Anyway, when it comes to posing, as long as you're doing it in Blender, Avastar really is the way to go. And Blender is free, so the whole process becomes a lot cheaper than, for example, paying monthly for Maya or Cinema 4D or what have you. So on the website, you'll want to create an account and buy, Avastar. I think I have version 2. They have 2 versions, and I can't remember how those work. But, yes, here we go. So you can pay in Lindens, or you can pay with PayPal. Oh, it's 18 euros. There we go. So around $20. And as far as I know, if you buy the latest version, you get updates for longer. Something like that. Anyway, I'm sure that, on the Second Life forum, someone will be able to explain this better, because I can't remember what version So anyway, on the Avastar website, you'll want to purchase Avastar and then download it. Alternatively, if you don't download it there, you can always go to my profile at a later date and then go to downloads, and it will be over here. Now, we're going to be using Blender 2.8 or newer for this tutorial, so I strongly suggest getting this version. Now, I'm running Blender 2.91, I think, so I know it'll work for me. And technically speaking, this version is still in beta, so there might still be bugs, but I haven't really noticed any when it comes to posing. I've only noticed a few when it comes to like rigging clothes or something like that, so you shouldn't worry about that. So, the next step, once you've downloaded it, is to open Blender. And when you open Blender, you'll be confronted with something like this. Now, first of all, we're not going to do anything with the scene because we have to install Avastar. So to do that, we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, and then Add-ons, and then Install. And then navigate to where your Avastar downloaded to. So mine is over here. And you're going to click Install Add-on. Now make sure that when you download the zip, that you don't unzip it. Blender wants a zip file for this add-on. So just click Install Add-on, and then it'll say this, and that means it's fine. And then in the search bar here, you can look for Avastar. And in case it isn't ticked here, make sure that you place a tick over here. So, the rest of this you can leave alone. And then you can close out of this and it'll automatically save. And now to make sure that you've installed it correctly, under Add, there should be a new Avastar button. So, now that we have Blender open, we need to get the character rig set up so that we can actually create our pose. And the easiest way to create a pose is to use a reference. So, in order to find a reference, you can very easily just type model pose into Google and you'll find something, I'm sure. Now, the good thing about poses in comparison to clothing is that people can't copyright poses. So you can very easily select whatever you want, like this pose here, for example. And of course, you can always tweak it, but it's always good to have a human reference if you're creating a human pose. So, what I then suggest doing is installing a program called PureRef. Now, this is completely optional, but I do recommend it because PureRef has a feature that enables you to overlay it over a software and basically keep it on always in front mode. And also, you can very easily, resize it so that, for example, if you have Blender behind it and it's too big, you can make it smaller and you can resize things within PureRef, but this is not going to be a PureRef tutorial. There are plenty of those around. And it's actually quite straightforward to use. You just pick the picture that you want, for example, from Google, and you literally just drag it in. And then if you use the scroll wheel to zoom out, you can sort of fit it to the window. So once you have your pose and you have it set up in PureRef, your reference that is, you can right-click in PureRef and go to Mode, Always on Top, or press Ctrl-Shift-A. And then you can press Ctrl-Shift-A again to untoggle this, or just click it again and it'll stop being in Always on Top mode. So, now that we have our reference set up, we can set up the actual Avastar rig. Now to do this, I strongly suggest deleting what's already in the scene. So the default cube, you don't really need the camera or the light because you're not really going to be rendering anything, but the most important thing is to just delete this because it will get in your way otherwise. So just click it and right-click, delete, or click it and press delete on your keyboard, or alternatively press X on your keyboard and then delete. So now you can go up to Add or press Shift-A, go down to Avastar, and we're going to select Complete. Now the reason for this is because it gives you a more complete overview of all the bones and the rig. But I haven't really played around with the other version, so just the skeleton version, so I would just suggest use Complete anyway. So yes, now that we have this in the scene, I'll give you a quick sort of simplified tutorial on how to move around in Blender. So to rotate around an object, you hold down the middle mouse button and it'll let you rotate around it. To pan, so to basically move left, right, up and down without rotating, you hold down Shift and the middle mouse button and you can do that. And then to zoom, you can just use your middle mouse button, or if you need slightly more refined movements, you can press Control and hold down the middle mouse button and it'll dolly, which is, the official term, but no, I've never really heard anyone say it out loud. Anyway, so now that you understand how to move around, you need to know how to move around objects. So I strongly suggest leaving the pose where it is. But if for whatever reason, for example, if you're doing a couples pose or a group pose, you need to move it, you can select this root bone at the bottom here, which is clearly marked with these arrows, and using G and any of the axes Y, X, or Z, you can move it along the corresponding axes. Now you can see which axis is which up here with this little widget. Z is going up, X is going this way, and Y is going this way. So, for example, if you wanted to move it to the side, you would press G and then X. And if you wanted to be more precise, you could hold down Shift and move your mouse, and it'll be much finer. Or if you want to move it along the grid, you can press Control and it'll snap. Press Enter to confirm, Escape to cancel. Then there's rotating. Now scaling we don't really need, but if you want to scale something, you press S and you just drag. Now obviously we can't really scale this because it's not designed for that. But what we can do is rotate. And that's going to be very important for this, because you're going to want to rotate all of these bones to make them, pose nicely. So for this, we're going to bring up our reference, and we're going to turn it into always on top mode. And then we're going to rotate some bones. So what we can clearly see is that her clavicle on this side is slightly higher than this side. So that's a good place to start. Now to rotate it, you can position the camera how you want it, or you can turn it into perfectly in front or side or top or bottom mode using the widget at the top here and selecting whichever view you want. Now I also know that you can use the keyboard shortcuts on the numpad, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. But that can be a bit confusing for beginners, so I would ignore the keyboard shortcuts for now and really prioritize this widget at the top here. Also, if it's too small, I know that you can resize it, so I recommend visiting the Blender wiki if you want to do that. Now, to rotate, we press R for rotate, and then moving the mouse without clicking, you can see that it rotates that bone. Now I'm going to press Escape and show another bone. And another bone. So as you can see, it does that with all of them. Now, if you press R twice, you can freely rotate in any direction, also just by moving the mouse. And if you want to confirm a rotation, you just press the right mouse button and it will confirm. If you want to cancel it halfway through, you press Escape and it'll snap back to where it was. Now, one thing that tends to get in my way with Avastar is the joints are basically locked by default. So that means that you can't necessarily rotate them all the way that you might want to. I'm trying to find a way to show you this. Yes, here, see, I can't rotate this all the way no matter how much I try. And the way to get around this is by selecting A on your keyboard, and then N, as in Nicole, and then going down to rigging in the panel that opens, and then scrolling down and you'll see Disable Rotation Limits. Now this can make things go wrong very quickly if you're trying to do an extreme pose, but I think for most poses it shouldn't really be too bad. So I'm going to select it, and then to get rid of this panel again, just press N again. And now you can see that I can rotate this however I want, as stupid as it may look. So say you rotate something and you don't like how it's rotated. Well, if you select that bone and press Alt-R, it'll reset the rotation. The same goes for movements. If you accidentally move the avatar, if you press Alt-G, it'll reset movement. So, now that we have the basics done, we can get onto the actual rigging, which is not entirely straightforward. There are a few things that we'll need to set up first. Now, in order to do this, we're going to have to open another window. This window, where you can see the rig, is the 3D viewport. This one over here I refer to as the navigation bar. I can't remember what it's actually called. And down here, what's open by default is the timeline. So hovering over here, you can open this up a little bit. And then if you click on this little clock icon, we can switch to a different one. Now I'm going to have to move this out of the way quickly. What we want is the dope sheet. You can access that by clicking on the little icon down here of the little clock and going to dope sheet, or you can press Shift F12. So at the moment we can't see anything, and that's because we have nothing selected. So in your scene, press A again to select everything. And then over here, it's quite faint, but when you hover over it, you can see that a little arrow appears. You want to click there, and then this summary panel will open. And then again, you want to click this arrow to open the drop down. And then make sure that you're in pose mode, select everything. And then we have to set a keyframe. Now, a keyframe is what the program reads as a pose. So if you don't have any keyframes, then there's nothing for the program to read. If you set a keyframe, it knows, when there's this keyframe, this happens, and at the next keyframe, that happens. So to set a keyframe, you want to select everything with A, and then press I, and go to Lock Rot, or Location and Rotation, as it's now called. And then things start happening. You'll start seeing all these little things here, and these are the names of the bones of the rig. So you can see face, eyelid, upper right, face, ear, one left. Now, these are not necessarily things that would move on their own in real life. For example, your ears, not all people can move their ears, you know what I mean? So, certain things we will have to mute. Now, how do we do that? This icon over here, if you select it, you can see it says Toggle Channel Muting. Now, we only need to mute a few select channels, and those are the origin, and then any channels that you don't want to be affected by the pose. Because what will happen if you don't mute channels that you don't want to be affected is that if you then go into Second Life and you play the pose, and you then, for example, using the Lalutka or the Genus HUD try to pose your avatar's face, it won't let you. If you try to use any pose to move certain things, it won't let you. So you need to mute certain things. Now, the things that I tend to mute are the eyes, all of these orange things over here, these brown ones, these green ones, and these red ones, the purple ones, and that's about it. So the green ones and these light blue ones you can leave checked, but the other ones I would mute, because those are generally ones that you're going to want to manipulate more finely. So now that we understand how to pose the rig, we need to understand when to pose the rig. Now, this is the thing that's not 100% straightforward. You can't pose your avatar on the first frame. The frames being these numbers over here. These are all frames. As you can see, by default, it's set to 1. We don't want that. We want to pose our avatar on 2. The reason for this is that we need an ease-in frame. So if you don't have an ease-in frame, what will happen is when you play the pose in world, your avatar will basically jump into it, and it can be quite visually, intense. So it's generally sort of a more welcome option, shall I say, to have an ease-in frame. But we're going to be working in reverse, so first we're going to be doing our second frame, which is the, quote, full pose, and then we're going to be doing the ease-in frame and creating it from our full pose. And I'll explain all of that when we get to it. But first, let's start posing our avatar. So, I will start with the clavicles, and the reason for this is because it gives a more natural appearance to the arms when they're bent. And also make sure that you rotate them in the side view as well, or you can do it from the top view if that's easier. It always depends on which bone you're moving. With more feminine style poses, I tend to put the clavicle back a little because it, puffs the chest out a little and it gives more confidence. And I think it's also, a way of showing that sexiness that a lot of these model poses want to express. So then you can just, I might speed through this because it might be a bit boring. If you want, like a speed pose or something like that, then I might do that in the future. But for now, I think I will speed through this and meet up with you again when I'm done. One thing I would also like to quickly mention is that when it comes to the fingers, there's a nifty little trick that you can do in Blender, and that is when you select the bones of the fingers, hold down Shift to select all of them, like so. And let's say this is the pose I want, but I want her hand, like in this picture, to sort of curve inwards a little. Well, that's quite easy to do. You select all of them, and then at the top here, this little icon is for where your origins are. Now, the origin of something is basically the point that it rotates around. You can think of it that way. So what we're going to set these to is individual origins, because there are 3 bones per finger, so we want each of them to rotate around its own axis. And then, moving to the front, if we pressed R, you'll see that they very naturally curve in both directions. So you can very quickly and very easily move the fingers how you want them to. Now you can do the same with this bone. And also in Blender 2.8, I think, and upwards, you no longer have to select all the bones. You just need to select the first one and it will naturally do that for you. I don't know if this was the case beforehand, so don't quote me on that. But anyway, now I'll continue posing and I'll catch you at the end. Okay, so now that my pose is finished, we are going to lock rot, or lock rotation, to make sure that it sets a keyframe for everything. So we're going to do this by pressing A and then I, location and rotation. And as you can see, it's created another set of yellow dots down here. So now if we scroll through, we can see that where the ease in pose is supposed to be, she's still T-posing. Now, how are we going to fix this? Well, we're going to position our cursor over that pose, and then we're going to click the little first thing here, the first little yellow dot here, and it'll select all of them, as you can see. And then we're going to right-click, delete keyframes, and they're gone. And now we're going to move back over this one, the finished pose, and we're going to click the first one, and right-click, duplicate, and slide it one to the left, and click to confirm, or press enter. And now we can see that there's no change because we copied the pose. So now we're going to move over to our ease in frame, and basically if this were a more dynamic pose, you would want, well, I guess with all poses, but especially with dynamic poses, you're going to want to position the avatar within the ease in pose halfway between a neutral sort of legs, hips width apart, arms down kind of a pose, and your final pose. So something in between those two. But for this pose, it's very simple. We're just going to bring the clavicles back down, bring the arms back a little bit, maybe rotate them a little, nothing too extreme. I would really suggest starting with more simple poses because it takes a little bit of practice to kind of figure out what's natural and what's not with these dynamic poses. So I would suggest maybe starting with simple things like I have here. So I'm just going to finish doing this, and you can see this is quite simple. There we go. And now we're going to press A again, and I, and lock rot to make sure that that keyframe is set. So now if we scrub between the two, we can see that there are changes that take place. And this will be a lot smoother in Second Life. The Second Life viewer itself will animate this for you, so you don't need to worry about that. Now, for people that want to do breathing animations, you will just want to extend this second keyframe. You will want to, duplicate it over and then duplicate it a few more times in between to set those high points of the chest going up and down. And then later when we get to exporting, I'll explain how to export it in a slightly different way. But for now, we don't actually need our reference anymore, so we can go to mode, always on top, and then we can go to window, minimize, and it'll be gone. So, we've muted everything we don't want, we have our keyframes set, we're pretty much ready to export. So, in order to export from Blender to Second Life, we need to go to the Render Properties tab, and then scroll down a little bit, and you'll see that there's this special Animation Export tab that comes from installing the Avastar plugin. And you can see it's set to Anim here, so for animation, because it knows that we're working with a pose. So, before we export, there are a few things that we need to set. The frames per second doesn't matter because we have 2 frames. If this were longer, you might want to play with that, depending on how smooth you want it to be. For example, I think anime is set at 24 frames per second, and TV, so non-animated stuff, actual, real-world people, I think that's a little bit higher, something like 29 frames or 30 frames. Anyway, what we need to do now is we need to set our start frame and our end frame. Now, coincidentally, these are correct with us. Starting on frame 1, which is our ease in, and ending on frame 2. Now, if you were doing a breathing animation, you would want this to be, for example, on frame 20, which is where your breathing animation might end, or however long it is. You would set the final frame to be end frame over here. Then, we're going to go down to loop settings. Now, we want the final pose to loop. If you are doing a breathing animation, you want the breathing section to loop minus the ease in frame. So we're going to tick loop animation, and then in will be frame 2, because that's the frame that our static pose is on, and out also 2. Again, if you're doing a breathing animation, this will look different. And then finally, we need to set our priority. Now, this depends entirely on what you're using your pose for. If you're using your pose for an animation override, then I suggest using a higher priority, because most animation overrides that I've used in the past have been priority 4. Now, there are mixed priority ones, but we're not going to be talking about those here. There are also priority 3 ones, but I suggest keeping poses for actual animation overrides at priority 4, or you can create multiple versions. Some animation override creators do that. But for just regular poses, like, for example, the poses that stun sell, I would suggest leaving it on priority 3. In my last tutorial, I set it to priority 4, and that is one of the mistakes. So it really depends on context. And then lastly, we're going to uncheck Apply Armature Scale, and then we can export. So in order to export, just click this button here and navigate to where you have your Second Life, files or whatever. Now I have a shop folder, and then I'm going to create a new folder for poses. And in there, you can name it whatever you want. Now I suggest leaving the .anim here, because I don't know if it automatically generates the file ending if you delete that when you save. So I would just select what's before that, and then make sure to name it something memorable. So in my case, my store name is Wareta, and then we're going to call it, what's a good pose name? Pretty Pose 01. If you were to make a pose pack, then you would want to name them one by one. And then we're going to export the animation. Now, you don't necessarily need to save your blend file anymore. For all intents and purposes, we've done what we needed to. If you were going to create multiple priority versions, then now you would set this to 4 and then export and save it as the same name, but for example in brackets priority 4. Or if you wanted to base another pose off of this one, then obviously you could save the blend file. But technically speaking, we're done with Blender. So now you can open your Bento Viewer, and you have to make sure that it's a viewer that supports Bento. So viewers that support that are the official viewer, Firestorm, and I think Black Dragon does as well. So in Firestorm, because I guess it's one of the most widely spread ones, it's the one I use, so for this tutorial I'm going to be showing how to do this in Firestorm, but it works very similarly in most of the other Bento viewers. You're going to go to Build, Upload, Animation, and then navigate to where your animation is. So Shop, Poses, and here it is, and then press Open. Now you can, if your naming convention in your files is different to your naming convention in Second Life, then I would suggest changing the name now. You can always change it later on, but once you start playing around with permissions, it can get a little bit tricky. So uploading the pose will cost you 10 lindens, so make sure you have that. And then once you upload, it should automatically save it into your animations folder. If not, just make sure your inventory is open. If you can't find your inventory down here, then hover over your bottom panel and right click, go to Toolbar Buttons, and then find the inventory button here and drag it down to the bar, whichever bar you want, the sidebars or the bottom bar, whichever one. And then click it to open it and navigate to your animations. And then in order to test the pose, we're going to right click and play in world. Playing locally means only you can see it. And for now, I'm actually going to disable my animation override. So now she is in the neutral sort of Second Life pose and play in world. And as you can see, it's very gradual because of that ease in pose that we created. Now, I strongly suggest getting premium so that you can gain access to the beta grid. I'm not going to explain how to do that in this tutorial, but if you want a tutorial on that, let me know in the comments and I will gladly make one. The reason I say that you should gain access to the beta grid is because you can upload on there without using your actual currency. So for example, if I'm not 100% happy with this pose, like she's looking up too much or whatever, then I can test that, or I guess beta test that on the beta grid first before uploading it to the main grid, which we're on now. But if that's all too complicated for you, then, poses only cost 10 lindens, which is only a few cents. So I suppose you don't need access to the beta grid just for poses. But if you plan on using Avastar for other things, then I would highly recommend you do. And now another way to test that muting those origins worked correctly is by opening the HUD of the mesh head, for example, that you're wearing, and going to animations and playing around with moving your avatar's facial features around and trying, the expressions. And as you can see, they're working fine because we muted those origins so that they weren't included in the pose. So yes, that pretty much concludes this tutorial. If I forgot anything or if you have any questions, please leave them down below and I will try to get back to everyone this time. I know that I went kind of AWOL with my last video and I really apologize for that. That was not my intention, but after the drama that I was having with my old microphone and then not having a microphone, I pretty much just rage quit in terms of tutorials. But yes, if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like the video, and if you want to see more content like this, then feel free to subscribe. Bye!